My name is Natalie Brooks. I am 34 years old, and if you were to ask my biological family about my life, they would tell you a very specific, carefully constructed story. They would tell you that I am a drifter, an unemployed failure who wasted every single opportunity ever handed to her, and a desperate woman scrambling to survive on temporary jobs. For 15 long years, I allowed them to believe that lie. I wore their contempt like a heavy, invisible shield, letting them whisper behind my back and shake their heads in fake pity whenever I walked into a room. I stayed silent because my silence was a camouflage. What my father and stepmother never knew, what they could never even begin to guess, was what I actually did for a living. I wasn't starving and I wasn't desperate. I was a senior forensic investigator specializing in financial fraud and elder exploitation for a federal agency. My entire professional life was dedicated to hunting down white-collar predators, the exact kind of monsters who look like pillars of the community but quietly bleed vulnerable people dry. I hid my success because I knew the terrifying truth about my own blood. If my father ever discovered how powerful I had become, he would have found a way to use that truth as a weapon to destroy me. Before I tell you how the walls of his empire came crashing down, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever had to hide your wins from your own family because you knew they would use your success against you? Have you ever had to shrink yourself just to keep the peace? If you've ever had to play the role of the unsuccessful child just to stay safe from the people who were supposed to love you, type the word camouflage in the comments right now. I'm watching and I want to see how many of us have had to survive in the shadows. Tell me what time it is where you are and where you are watching this from. Let's see how far this story will travel. The turning point happened on a bitterly cold Tuesday evening. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, displaying a single crisp photograph sent from an encrypted number. It was an image of a small blue porcelain cup resting on a wooden table, its handle facing directly toward the front door. Beneath the photograph were 6 simple words: "The flower tin is empty again." To anyone else, it would look like the harmless, slightly confused message of an aging woman losing her grip on reality. But as I stared at the screen, the blood drained from my face. My hands began to shake, not from fear, but from a sudden, cold rush of adrenaline. This was not a random text. This was a coded plea for help. A distress signal that had been designed more than 2 decades ago. My grandmother Judy was the only person in that family who truly saw me. She was a brilliant, fiercely independent woman trapped in a household ruled by a master manipulator. When I was just a young girl, she taught me a secret language, a way to speak when the walls had ears. The blue cup facing the front door meant she was being actively monitored and could not speak freely under any circumstances. The empty flower tin meant that someone had crossed a line and taken something deeply important from her. This wasn't nostalgia, and it wasn't a mistake. It was a silent cry of terror. Exactly 30 minutes after that text appeared on my screen, I arrived at my childhood home with 2 uniformed police officers standing right behind me. The camouflage was off. The hunt had officially begun. To truly understand why a blue porcelain cup could make my blood run cold, you have to understand the man who ruled that house with an iron fist disguised in a velvet glove. My father, Tom Brooks, was a highly respected financial advisor in the city. If you looked at his public life, he was a saint. He was the man who gave massive, tear-jerking speeches at charity dinners, donated tens of thousands of dollars to local senior centers, and presented himself to the world as the fiercely devoted, angelic son caring for his aging, fragile mother. He built a flawless public shield made of philanthropy and smiles. But behind closed doors, his generosity wasn't kindness. It was a calculated investment in his own invulnerability. Growing up under his roof was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Tom's cruelty was terrifying because it was always so calm, so profoundly reasonable. He never raised his voice. He never threw things or left physical bruises. Instead, he engineered a slow, suffocating environment where my self-worth was systematically dismantled over a period of 15 years. Every single family dinner was an exercise in public humiliation. He would sit at the head of the table, flanked by my stepmother, Lisa, who always wore a tight, controlled smile designed strictly for the benefit of any onlookers. Tom would look at me with deep, performative sadness in his eyes. He wouldn't insult me directly. Instead, he would lean toward my cousins or our wealthy neighbors, lower his voice to an embarrassed whisper on my behalf, and say things like, "We're all just praying Natalie finds her footing soon." It's so heartbreaking to see someone with so much potential simply give up on life. He made the entire extended family believe I was emotionally unstable, flaky, and completely dependent on the secret financial handouts my grandmother smuggled to me. The psychological damage of that treatment is something you don't just shake off. It changes the way you breathe. It changes the way you look in a mirror. I allowed them to believe every single devastating lie. Why? Because I realized early on that in Tom Brooks's world, weakness was safe. If he thought I was a pathetic, struggling failure, I remained outside his line of fire. If he knew I had built a highly successful career in federal financial law, his envy would have turned predatory. He hated anything he couldn't personally control or take credit for. Success in his house was treated as a direct act of treason unless it belonged to him. Take a moment to think about your own life as you listen to this. Have you ever had to intentionally look weak just to keep a toxic person from attacking you? Have you ever had to swallow your pride and let people believe the absolute worst about you because the truth was too dangerous to share? Type the word control in the comments if you know exactly what it feels like to live under that kind of shadow. The silence I kept wasn't submission. It was a tactical retreat. I was playing the long game, waiting for the one piece of evidence that would expose the rot beneath his golden foundation. Little did I know, that evidence was already being gathered by the bravest woman I have ever known. The secret language between my grandmother and me wasn't born out of a game. It was forged in a moment of pure childhood heartbreak. When I was 12 years old, I won my first major academic medal. I remember running home, my heart pounding with pride, holding the heavy brass medallion tightly in my small hand. But when I showed it to my father, his face didn't light up with joy. Instead, a cold, dark cloud settled over his features. He accused me of embarrassing the family, claiming that my desperate need to show off made my cousins feel small and uncomfortable. He told me that success was deeply unattractive when it was used to diminish other people. Under his cold, unyielding stare, he ordered me to march straight to the kitchen and throw my achievement into the trash can. I stood there, a devastated 12-year-old girl, tears streaming down my face as the medal clanked against the bottom of the bin. My father walked away, satisfied that he had crushed my spirit. But my grandmother, Judy, had been standing quietly in the shadows of the hallway. The moment his footsteps faded, she walked into the kitchen, reached deep into the trash, and pulled my medal out. She gently wiped my tears, wrapped the medal in a faded blue silk ribbon from her sewing box, and hid it deep inside an old flour tin at the back of her pantry. That day, she looked into my eyes and whispered a sentence that became the foundational truth of my entire life. "Some people don't hate your weakness, Natalie. They hate the proof that you were never weak." From that afternoon forward, the flour tin and the blue silk ribbon became our sacred pact. She taught me that If she ever faced a situation where she could not speak because my father was monitoring her, she would place her favorite blue porcelain cup on the table with its handle pointing directly toward the front door. And if the flour tin, the hiding place of our shared secret, was ever emptied, it meant someone had stepped over the line and taken something vital from her. For over 20 years, that tin remained untouched, a silent monument to our resilience. But now, staring at the photograph on my phone, I knew the unthinkable had happened. The cup was turned. The tin was empty. This was a cold, calculated emergency, and my grandmother was trapped inside her own home with a predator. As a senior forensic investigator, I knew exactly what happened to elderly victims when their family members turned on them. Financial abuse is a silent killer. It isolates the victim, strips them of their dignity, and slowly erases their existence before anyone outside even notices. I knew I couldn't just walk in there as an angry granddaughter. If I did, Tom would use his immense community influence and his carefully constructed lies to bar me from the property permanently, isolating Judy completely. I had to use the system. I bypassed the standard channels, filed an immediate, high-priority emergency welfare check with local law enforcement, and laid out the precise psychological and historical context of the coded distress signal to the shift commander. I didn't care if my father's pristine mask was about to crack. I was coming for my grandmother, and I was bringing the full weight of the law with me. Exactly 30 minutes after my grandmother's message pierced through my life, the tires of my car gripped the gravel driveway of my childhood home. The engine died, and the silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic flashing of the blue and red lights from the police cruiser parked directly behind me. I stepped out into the freezing night air, my heels clicking sharply against the concrete sidewalk as two uniformed officers moved into formation, flanking me. When I reached the heavy oak front door, I didn't knock like a timid guest. I rang the bell and held it down, signaling an official presence. The door swung open, and there stood Tom Brooks. He was wearing a plush cashmere sweater, looking every bit the picture of relaxed, affluent serenity. But as his eyes traveled from my face to the shiny metal badges pinned to the officers' chests, a subtle shift occurred in his features. His expression showed absolute recognition, not a single flicker of surprise. Before either of the officers could utter a single word of our official script, Tom leaned forward just an inch, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. He whispered something so quiet, so filled with toxic confidence, that it proved he had known my secret far longer than I had ever imagined. "You should have stayed invisible, Natalie," he hissed, his voice a razor-thin blade of malice. "Your employer will hear about this." I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the winter wind. For 15 years, I thought I was the one playing the clever game of camouflage. I thought I was hiding in plain sight. But in that single, horrifying second on the threshold of his home, I realized the terrifying truth. Tom hadn't been fooled by my act. He had been watching me, tracking me, and waiting for me to step into his territory. But I couldn't let my composure shatter. I am a trained federal investigator. I have stared down seasoned cartel accountants and corporate embezzlers without blinking. I forced my breathing to remain perfectly steady, my face morphing into a mask of pure professional detachment. Before I could reply, my stepmother, Lisa, appeared from the warmth of the hallway. She wore that practiced, carefully controlled smile she always saved for strangers, her eyes darting nervously between the police officers. Tom immediately pivoted, his voice shifting seamlessly into the tone of a deeply burdened, saintly patriarch. He looked at the officers, offering a weary, paternal sigh that was devastatingly effective because it sounded so completely reasonable. "Officers, I apologize for this deeply embarrassing situation," Tom said, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial murmur, instantly trying to make the police feel as though they had been dragged into a messy, private family misunderstanding caused by an unstable child. "My daughter Natalie has a documented history of severe emotional overreacting. She has been incredibly unstable since losing her last job, and I'm afraid she's projecting her personal failures onto our household." If you are listening to this right now, I want you to take a deep breath and think about the sheer, suffocating horror of that tactic. It's called weaponized gaslighting. It's when a predator uses a calm, gentle tone to paint you as the crazy one to the authorities, making your legitimate cry for help look like a mental breakdown. If you have ever experienced someone turning the truth upside down to make you look unstable, type the words, "I see you" in the comments right now. Let's expose these quiet tactics together. I stood there, refusing to interrupt him, because I knew every lie he uttered in front of these officers was a rope he was quietly wrapping around his own neck. Tom's performance was masterful, but I wasn't an amateur civilian who could be easily intimidated by a father's disapproval. I stood my ground. My hands slid deep into my coat pockets, keeping my posture entirely professional. One of the responding officers, a seasoned veteran who had clearly seen his fair share of domestic disputes, stepped forward, cutting through Tom's smooth monologue. He politely but firmly asked to see my grandmother, Judy. Tom didn't blink. His charming mask remained perfectly intact as he claimed she was deep asleep and highly confused by a recent adjustment to her medication. But the officers, following the strict protocols I had laid out during the emergency dispatch, insisted on speaking with her face-to-face to verify her safety. After a tense moment of heavy silence, Judy appeared at the far end of the hallway. My heart ached when I saw her. She looked so much smaller, so much more fragile than she had just 2 weeks prior. The fiercely proud woman who had once adamantly refused to leave her bedroom without her signature red lipstick now stood before us with a pale, bare face and a cardigan buttoned completely incorrectly, one flap hanging lower than the other. As she slowly walked toward the door, her sleeve pulled up just enough to reveal a faint, yellowish-purple bruise wrapping around her thin wrist. When the officer gently asked if she felt safe in the home, Judy's eyes immediately darted toward Tom's rigid back before she whispered a barely audible, "I'm fine." Legally, the officers couldn't force an immediate removal based solely on a vague suspicion and a whispered reassurance from a terrified adult. However, they knew the law well enough to separate Tom from her for a few crucial moments to ask standard basic safety questions. While they moved into the living room to speak with her, I stepped into the hallway, my eyes frantically scanning the environment for any physical clues. That's when I saw it. Resting on top of an old cabinet near the umbrella stand was a faded blue silk ribbon tied neatly around her old wooden sewing box. It was the exact ribbon from my childhood academic medal. In our secret language, that ribbon wasn't just a piece of fabric. It was an explicit instruction. When Tom stepped into the kitchen to grab a glass of water for the officers, Judy used the momentary distraction to subtly push the heavy wooden sewing box toward me with the toe of her shoe. My federal training instantly took complete control of my actions. An untrained person would have snatched the box up, ripped it open, and started screaming about what they found. But I knew better. Because I was biologically related to everyone in this house, the legal chain of custody for any evidence I uncovered had to be absolutely flawless and completely unassailable in a court of law. I did not open the box. Instead, I pulled out my phone, photographed its exact physical location on the floor, and loudly asked the second police officer to witness my grandmother handing the object to me. I explicitly recorded her verbal consent on my device. Tom returned from the kitchen, his eyes locking onto the box in my hands. His face turned a deep, dark shade of crimson as he ordered me to get out of his house immediately. But before I could move, Judy raised her head, a sudden spark of her old fire returning to her eyes. "She is my guest," she stated, her voice remarkably clear. Tom took a step toward her, reaching out toward her fragile shoulder with a patronizing, heavy hand, trying to guide her away like a confused, misbehaving child. But Judy flinched, visibly moving away from his touch. "I invited her," she repeated, looking directly at the officers. The police immediately documented his physical attempt to override her wishes, along with her clear, negative physical reaction to his approach. Outside on the concrete sidewalk, Tom followed me all the way to my car. The moment the officers were out of hearing range, his pleasant savior of the community expression vanished completely, replaced by a sneer of pure, unadulterated venom. "You should have stayed invisible, Natalie," he whispered. His teeth clenched so tightly they looked ready to shatter. "Your employer will hear about this." I stopped dead in my tracks, my hand gripping the cold handle of my car door. I turned slowly to face him, a sharp, dangerous realization dawning on me. For 15 long years, my family had supposedly believed I was a pathetic, unemployed drifter living on pennies. If he truly believed that lie, he shouldn't have known there was an actual employer to contact in the first place. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice dropping to a calm, icy whisper. "Which employer, Tom?" I asked. He smiled, a slow, sickening smirk that crept across his face like a oil slick on water, as if I had finally solved a complex riddle he had been enjoying entirely alone for years. "Exactly," he murmured before turning on his heel and walking back into the house. I got into my car, my heart hammering against my ribs. The camouflage wasn't just blown. It had never actually existed. He had been playing me all along. I drove directly from my childhood home to my agency's secure regional headquarters. The red and blue police lights still burned into my retinas. The building was completely dark except for the security desk, but I didn't care about the hour. I immediately contacted my direct supervisor and disclosed the massive personal conflict of interest before my fingers even brushed the brass latch of my grandmother's wooden sewing box. Protocol in federal financial law is everything. If you violate it, the smartest case in the world can dissolve in front of a judge in seconds. My supervisor acted swiftly. She officially removed me from any active, formal investigative role in the unfolding family matter to preserve the integrity of the evidence. She immediately assigned the formal evidence review to Edward Hale, a brilliant forensic accountant who had worked beside me for 6 long years. Edward was a meticulous man who lived for spreadsheets and hidden paper trails. He knew my meticulous work habits, understood the absolute necessity of flawless evidence preservation, and had never once questioned why my toxic family believed I did low-level temporary research jobs. With my supervisor standing right behind us in the sterile, fluorescent light of the review room, Edward pulled on a pair of black nitrile gloves and carefully opened the latch of the sewing box. What we found inside wasn't a collection of nostalgic trinkets. It was a meticulously organized criminal archive. Inside were 3 crisp bank envelopes, a heavy old brass key, a sleek black flash drive, a small handwritten ledger, my childhood academic medal, and a small, amber pharmacy bottle containing pills that Judy had deliberately stopped taking because they made her feel profoundly disoriented and helpless. Edward immediately picked up the pharmacy bottle. The prescription label showed that Tom had recently changed the dispensing pharmacy to an obscure provider across town. Edward set the bottle down and carefully pulled the contents out of the first bank envelope. It contained official withdrawal notices from Judy's primary accounts totaling more than $187,000. The second envelope held complex legal corporate documents, transferring partial ownership of my grandmother's historic home into a company called North Star Care Solutions. The third contained a durable power of attorney carrying Judy's elegant signature at the bottom. Edward leaned in close under the magnifying lamp, his eyes narrowing. "The signature looks incredibly convincing, Natalie," he muttered, running a finger just above the paper. "But look at the witness listed beneath it. I know this name from a previous local banking audit. This witness died 11 months before this document was supposedly signed." My chest tightened as the pieces began to click together. North Star Care Solutions claimed on paper to provide high-end elder care management for wealthy seniors, yet its registered corporate address led straight to a rented commercial mailbox in a dilapidated strip mall. But the true devastating twist was yet to come. The authorized financial officer listed on the state incorporation documents was not Tom Brooks. It was me. My full legal name, my exact date of birth, and a terrifyingly accurate digital replica of my electronic signature appeared on the official state registration documents. Attached to the file was an old apartment address I had lived in when I first joined the federal agency a decade ago. Edward looked up at me, his face completely pale. "Natalie, someone spent years building a bulletproof corporate structure designed entirely to make it look like you were the one systematically stealing from your own grandmother." The absolute, cold-blooded, brilliant malice of Tom Brooks fully revealed itself in that moment. He had spent 15 long years calling me an irresponsible, desperate, unemployed failure to every relative, neighbor, and family friend who would listen. He didn't do it out of simple cruelty. He did it as an organized legal defense. He wanted a mountain of community consensus, stating that I was broke and unstable. If my grandmother ever woke up to his schemes, or if an auditor ever flagged the missing money, Tom could simply point his finger at me. He could claim that her Tung-Quan, unemployed granddaughter, had manipulated an old woman with dementia to fund her desperate life. Before I could process the horror of my own father setting me up for a federal prison sentence, Edward plugged the black flash drive into our air-gapped forensic computer. The drive contained digital banking statements, secret recordings of Tom pressuring Judy to sign papers late at night, and a short video my grandmother had captured using an old tablet hidden in her bedroom wardrobe. On the screen, Judy's face appeared, her voice trembling but filled with an undeniable, fierce clarity. "If Natalie is watching this," she said, looking directly into the lens, "Tom has probably told everyone in the family that she is a parasite after my money. She isn't. He has been carefully preparing that lie for years. He keeps saying nobody will ever believe the failure over the successful son." The video abruptly cut to black as the heavy sound of footsteps approached her bedroom door. Edward leaned back in his chair, a dark look in his eyes. "He created a scapegoat before he ever moved a single dollar," he said quietly. One entry in Judy's handwritten ledger had been underlined twice in thick black ink. The note read, "Tom asked whether Natalie's agency would protect her if the family learned what she really does for a living." The date of that entry was 3 years ago. Tom had known my secret all along, and he had been systematically collecting the pieces needed to manufacture my guilt. Edward submitted the physical and digital evidence through the agency's official channels, while I signed a formal, binding recusal statement. Because of my biological ties to the targets, I could provide background history and testify about what I witnessed on the scene, but I could not search restricted federal systems, direct witness interviews, or make any investigative decisions. Tom understood enough about legal procedure to exploit that exact restriction. He knew that by tangling me in a web of personal conflict, he could slow down the wheels of federal justice just enough to execute his escape velocity. 2 days after the police visit, an email popped up on my personal computer. It was from Tom's executive assistant, titled with his signature corporate politeness. Opportunity to resolve a private family misunderstanding. He invited me to his office. I accepted the meeting without a single second of hesitation, because I knew that in the chess game of fraud investigation, refusing to meet would allow him to claim in court that I had actively avoided a reasonable, calm family conversation. Before walking out the door, I gave Edward my exact time and location, formally documented that I would not carry any official agency, investigative material, and activated an emergency tracking and contact protocol normally reserved for high-risk, hostile interviews. His financial consulting firm occupied the entire top floor of a gleaming glass skyscraper overlooking the Manhattan skyline. As I stepped out of the elevator, the environment practically screamed wealth and unassailable morality. The walls were lined with large framed photographs of Tom shaking hands with mayors, donating giant checks to children's hospitals, and speaking at senior advocacy programs. The young receptionist behind the marble desk greeted him warmly when he walked past, and she whispered to me, while I waited, that Tom had personally covered a significant part of her husband's recent surgery. That was exactly what made my father so incredibly dangerous. He performed enough genuine, public kindness to make his private, dark cruelty completely unbelievable to the average person. He chose his moments of public generosity with surgical precision so that the people most likely to defend him would always have a deeply moving, personal story of his goodness to share with a jury. He welcomed me into his expansive corner office with a warm, paternal smile, offered me a cup of premium coffee, and smoothly slid a thick manila folder across the polished mahogany desk. I didn't touch the coffee. I opened the folder. Inside were high-resolution surveillance photographs of me entering my federal agency building, speaking at specialized forensic conferences, having lunch with Edward, and receiving a federal service award. There were printed copies of professional publications I had written under an abbreviated pen name and a comprehensive list of federal cases in which I had testified as an expert witness. "You told the family you did freelance research for minor firms, Natalie," he said, leaning back in his leather chair, interlocking his fingers over his chest. "Meanwhile, you built an entire career accusing good people of terrible crimes." I stared at the photographs of my life, keeping my heart rate entirely level. "How long have you had me followed, Tom?" I asked, my voice completely flat. "Long enough," he replied with a cold, dismissive shrug. When Mort asked why he still insisted on calling me a tunquan, unemployed failure to our relatives, if he knew the truth, his smile widened, revealing the dark abyss behind his charm. "Because it was the only role you played convincingly, Natalie." People believe what they hear repeated, over and over again, especially when the person being discussed never stands up to defend herself. He then placed a second document on top of the photographs, a professionally drafted legal complaint addressed directly to my agency's Inspector General. It accused me of massive official misconduct, claiming I was using classified government resources to wage a personal vendetta and illegally investigate my own family. Attached to the complaint were highly sophisticated, fabricated digital access logs, appearing to show that I had personally searched Judy's private banking accounts months before her distress message ever existed. The logs were completely false, but they were technically advanced enough to trigger an immediate, mandatory federal review. Tom leaned across the desk, his eyes burning with a chilling, predatory focus as he explained exactly what would happen the moment he pressed send on that complaint. Immediate suspension, internal and affairs investigation, public challenges to every single one of my previous successful fraud cases, and renewed, agonizing hearings for vulnerable people whose victims believed justice had already been permanently secured. He slowly mentioned 2 specific past cases by name, including a tragic one involving a heartbroken widow whose entire retirement fund had been stolen by a smooth-talking scammer. He had meticulously studied which victims I cared about the most. He was entirely willing to destroy the lives of innocent strangers just to build a shield for himself. "You have exactly 48 hours, Tom said, his voice dropping to a low, rhythmic hum. "Go to Judy, tell her she completely misunderstood the estate planning documents, withdraw your official allegations, and I will publicly explain that North Star was created strictly for her long-term care. Continue down this path, and your precious career becomes the very first casualty. After that, you and I will have a very serious legal discussion about whether Judy remains mentally competent enough to continue living alone in that big house." His plan was a masterclass in absolute leverage. He intended to transfer the remainder of Judy's liquid money, accuse me of secretly controlling the North Star entity from the shadows, and portray the entire federal investigation as my desperate attempt to hide my own financial fraud. As I sat in that high-backed chair, I faced the ultimate dilemma of a survivor. When someone you love uses your own sense of family loyalty as a weapon to destroy you, do you preserve the toxic relationship? Or do you fully expose the rotten foundation it was built to conceal? I stood up, left the manila folder resting untouched on his mahogany desk, and walked out into the cold New York air without saying a single word. I didn't have to wait 48 hours for the next crack in Tom's armor to appear. That very evening, my phone rang from an unknown number. It was my stepmother, Lisa. Her voice was unrecognizable, stripped of the cold, condescending arrogance she usually wielded like a weapon. She frantically begged me to meet her at a quiet hotel cafe on the edge of the city. When I arrived, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Lisa was sitting alone at a corner table, wearing large, dark sunglasses despite the dim indoor lighting. She had deliberately selected a table that faced both emergency exits. I sat down across from her, watching silently as she reached for her water glass. Her hands trembled so violently that the ice clinked against the glass. Yet, the moment the server approached our table, her posture instantly snapped into a rigid, perfectly composed display of upper-class elegance. I recognized that survival instinct immediately. She had spent a decade under Tom's roof. She had learned to hide her terror just as carefully as Tom hid his systemic cruelty. I braced myself for another painful lecture about family loyalty, another rehearsed threat designed to make me back down. Instead, Lisa slid a small plastic keycard across the white tablecloth. "This opens the door to Tom's private records room at the back of his residential office," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her panic. "There are files in there, Natalie. Documents that should never have existed in a civilized world." My investigative training instantly overrode my personal emotions. I stared at the plastic card, but kept my hands flat on the table, completely refusing to touch it. "I can't take that, Lisa," I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady murmur. Entering his private property without explicit legal authority or a federal warrant would allow Tom to instantly accuse me of burglary. It would contaminate every single piece of evidence I found in that room, making it completely inadmissible in a court of law. Hearing that, Lisa broke down, burying her face in her trembling hands. She admitted that she wasn't an innocent bystander. She had willingly signed corporate minutes for North Star Care Solutions and witnessed legal forms after Tom told her it was just an aggressive, legitimate strategy for family estate planning. At first, she fully enjoyed the incredibly lavish lifestyle his financial schemes funded. She chose to deliberately ignore the glaring red flags and the questions she absolutely should have asked. But reality had finally caught up to her. Just days ago, she discovered that North Star had secretly borrowed heavily against Judy's historic home, paid for Tom's personal luxury expenses, and transferred massive sums of cash directly into obscure consulting accounts tied to Tom's primary financial firm. When she frantically confronted him in private, the savior mask slipped completely. Tom didn't comfort her. Instead, he pulled out copies of the corporate documents bearing her own genuine signature and coldly warned her that if she ever spoke a single word to the authorities, she would be prosecuted as the primary mastermind while he stood back as an innocent, betrayed husband. Lisa was far from innocent. She had spent 15 years laughing at cruel family jokes about my unemployment, actively encouraged Judy to let Tom handle every single bank account, and helped systematically isolate my grandmother from her oldest friends. But she had also just discovered the ultimate rule of surviving Tom Brooks. He considered everyone around him entirely disposable. She revealed that his 48-hour ultimatum to me was a complete smokescreen. He planned to move the remaining liquid assets out of Judy's accounts within the next 48 hours anyway. He was currently forcing my grandmother to sign a heavily revised trust, a new medical authorization, and a pre-written legal statement explicitly accusing me of elder coercion and financial harassment. To ensure it stuck, Tom had already arranged for a corrupt private doctor to conduct a formal mental evaluation of Judy after deliberately increasing the dosage of the medication that made her profoundly confused. Most importantly, Lisa disclosed a crucial piece of technical intelligence. Tom secretly recorded every single meeting inside his private records room and automatically backed the encrypted video files up to an off-site server. He had told her that those recordings were his ultimate insurance policy, because in his cynical world, everyone betrayed you eventually. I looked at her, seeing the sheer panic radiating from her eyes. "You need to go to Edward and the local detectives immediately, Lisa," I told her firmly. "You need to make a full, formal, recorded statement on the record." "I can't," she wept, her voice trembling. "He will completely destroy me, Natalie. He has private messages, financial trails. He will leave me facing every single federal charge entirely alone. He has already prepared the evidence to do exactly that to you," I said, leaning in closer, forcing her to look into my eyes. "Compliance with a predator never buys your safety, Lisa. It only decides how much more devastating evidence he gets to create against you before he pulls the trigger." Before she stood up to leave the cafe, she leaned across the table, her face completely pale under her sunglasses. "There's one more thing you need to know, Natalie. Tom keeps a thick physical file bearing your name in that safe. He has maintained it since before you even passed the Federal Academy. The very first page of that file is labeled with a single word: contingency." Walking away from that hotel, a cold clarity settled over me. This was no longer just a standard case of elder asset theft. Tom Brooks hadn't just stumbled into a fraud scheme. He had been actively preparing for a final legal confrontation with me for 15 long years. Every single family insult, every joke about my failure, and every rumor he spread to our relatives had been part of a meticulously organized, long-term psychological defense. He was building a wall of lies, brick by brick, preparing for the day I finally looked too closely at his ledger. The 48-hour window closed with the force of a legal guillotine. True to his word, Tom pressed send on his fabricated complaint. The impact was immediate and devastating to my professional life. By noon the following day, I had to formally surrender my federal badge, my agency-issued laptop, my sensitive case files, and my official credentials pending a full internal review. My supervisor didn't accuse me of wrongdoing, but strict federal policy required my immediate administrative removal until the access logs and corporate records could be independently verified by internal affairs. Tom had brilliantly turned my long-term strategy of professional secrecy into weaponized evidence of my supposed guilt. The fallout spread through my life like a toxic oil spill. A highly anticipated promotion interview I had spent a year preparing for was abruptly canceled. An aggressive defense attorney connected to one of my current federal investigations caught wind of the scandal and immediately filed a formal request for my disciplinary records. Two separate defense teams filed emergency motions in court, openly questioning whether I had fabricated financial evidence in completely unrelated past cases. Even my personal life was invaded. My landlord received an ominous, officially worded letter warning that federal agents might execute a search warrant on my apartment. Someone even went so far as to send anonymous, highly detailed messages to my neighbors, claiming I was an unstable fraudster who targeted vulnerable, elderly people for money. For several agonizing hours, sitting alone in the heavy silence of my dark apartment, I considered giving Tom exactly what he wanted. I didn't want to surrender because I believed his lies, but because I couldn't bear the thought of innocent victims from my old cases being dragged through new, painful hearings just to protect my name. That was when my phone rang. It was Susan Mercer, the veteran elder protection specialist who had been officially assigned to my grandmother's file. She insisted on meeting me inside Judy's house while Tom was away at a high-profile corporate charity luncheon. When I walked into that familiar kitchen, Judy was sitting at the wooden table. She looked at my face, noted the dark circles under my eyes, and immediately heard the heavy hesitation in my voice. "He hurt your work, didn't he, Natalie?" she asked, her voice dropping to a gentle, aching whisper. I closed my eyes and swallowed the lump in my throat, admitting for the very first time that he had completely stripped me of my career. "Then stop, sweetheart," Judy said, reaching out to touch my arm. "Stop this fight for me. I am old. I can survive whatever he does next. Don't let him burn your life down to save mine." I looked at her, seeing the same woman who had pulled my academic medal out of the trash bin 22 years ago. I shook my head firmly. "I can't stop now, Grandma," I said, my voice cracking but growing steady. "If I stop now, he gets to permanently decide what my entire career meant. He gets to tell the world I only protected strangers, because I was secretly preparing to rob you. Every single victim I have ever helped will become a footnote in his grand lie." Judy was completely quiet for nearly a full minute, her fingers tracing the worn edge of the wooden table. Then, she lifted her chin, a profound, unbreakable steel flashing in her faded eyes. "Then we finish it," she said, her voice dropping all trace of fear. "But we finish it together." She slowly stood up, walked over to her antique corner cabinet, and pulled out a worn, leather-bound hymnal she had kept since her youth. With steady fingers, she peeled back the heavy fabric of the back cover. Hidden neatly inside the lining was a pristine, legally notarized revocation of Tom's power of attorney, signed and stamped exactly 8 months earlier. "I tried to give this to the head branch manager at the bank last year," Judy whispered, a fierce pride radiating from her face. "But Tom found out through his connections, declared I was mentally incompetent, and forced me to sign another form. I kept this copy hidden because I wanted proof that, For at least one day in my life, I looked at him and said no. She also revealed that she had deliberately written several blatantly incorrect dates in her financial ledger. She knew Tom occasionally searched her bedroom when she was asleep, and the incorrect dates helped her determine exactly which pages he had read when he later repeated those false details to her during his late-night psychological lectures. My grandmother had never been entirely passive. She had been executing her own silent, brilliant resistance, waiting patiently for the one person who knew how to read her signals. While my grandmother and I were aligning our forces in that quiet kitchen, Edward Hale was hard at work inside the agency's forensic lab, turning Tom's own digital weapons against him. 2 days after my suspension, Edward called me from a secure, encrypted line. He had spent 48 hours straight dismantling the fabricated access logs Tom had submitted to the Inspector General. And he had found the smoking gun. Tom is a brilliant financial advisor, Natalie, but he isn't a federal IT specialist, Edward said, his voice buzzing with professional satisfaction. The forged access logs he sent to frame you contained a fatal, archaic mistake. The hackers he hired to manipulate the data listed a server file format that our agency had completely phased out and stopped using 2 full years before the alleged unauthorized searches took place. It's a digital impossibility. But Edward didn't stop at proving the logs were fake. He traced their true origin. Deep within the hidden metadata of the electronic files, investigators discovered embedded digital signatures linking them directly to Tom's primary financial firm. One of the master files had been created on the desktop computer sitting right inside Tom's corner office. Even more damning, a second file had been edited and uploaded using Lisa's personal corporate credentials at exactly 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday, a date when she had officially claimed to be out of town on a spa retreat. The digital signature they used to forge my authorization had been lifted directly from a family tax return Tom had handled for me nearly a decade earlier. Just as Edward was laying out the technical blueprint of Tom's trap, my personal cell phone vibrated. It was a call from a prepaid burner phone. When I answered, Lisa's breathless, panicked voice filled the receiver. She was hiding in her car outside a local grocery store. "Natalie, he knows the walls are closing in," she whispered, sobbing into the phone. "Tom just ordered me to sign a sworn legal statement claiming that you came to my hotel room, physically threatened me, and blackmailed me into giving you his private record room keycard by threatening to expose an old affair I had years ago. He has preserved every single old message from that affair to use as insurance against me. If I don't sign it by tomorrow morning, he's going to ruin me." "Lisa, listen to me very carefully," I said, my voice dropping to an icy, commanding tone. "He is going to ruin you anyway. If you sign that false statement, you are committing felony perjury on top of corporate fraud. You need to walk into the district attorney's office right now before he creates a narrative you can never escape." The fear of immediate destruction finally broke her loyalty to Tom. The very next morning, Lisa walked into the district attorney's office accompanied by a high-profile criminal defense attorney. She formally turned over her personal phone, her encrypted emails, hidden financial documents, and a physical backup drive she had quietly stolen out of Tom's primary home safe. In her recorded deposition, she admitted to everything. Signing false corporate minutes, helping Tom systematically isolate Judy from her family, repeating the calculated lies about my chronic unemployment, and allowing Tom to use her corporate credentials to manufacture the false evidence against me. Her sudden cooperation did not erase the decade of psychological damage she had helped inflict on our family, but it completely destroyed the united front Tom depended upon to survive. With Lisa's explosive confession on the record, a federal judge signed emergency preservation orders and sweeping search warrants for North Star's hidden bank accounts, Tom's physical office records, and the off-site recording server Lisa had exposed. When the federal tech team recovered that off-site server, they found an absolute goldmine of criminal intent. The server contained years of automatically recorded conversations. We listened to audio files of Tom calmly coaching Lisa to describe Judy as increasingly confused to her doctors. We found recorded phone calls of Tom discussing backdated signatures with a corrupt notary and directing illegal wire transfers through the North Star accounts. In one horrifying audio file captured just 6 months prior, Tom was heard explaining his grand strategy to his private accountant. Natalie is listed as the primary officer of North Star on paper. Tom's voice boomed through the speakers, dripping with arrogant confidence. Everyone in this town knows she's an unstable failure who can't hold a job and relies on her grandmother for money. She works in fraud investigation, so if she ever discovers what I'm doing and tries to blow the whistle, we simply tell the board she created the fraudulent evidence herself to extort the families. The story tells itself. Tom had never underestimated my intelligence. He had studied my career, mapped out my psychological patterns, and realized that my predictable silence and avoidance of family drama made me the perfect target. He had built a flawless cage for me, but he forgot one fundamental rule of forensic investigation. A cage built out of digital lies always leaves an electronic trail. We now had his own voice documenting his malice, and the trap was finally ready to sprung. The emergency legal petition, prepared swiftly by elder law attorney Patricia Monroe, struck Tom's empire like a sudden lightning bolt. It instantly froze every single disputed asset, suspended Tom's authority, blocked any unauthorized changes to Judy's medical records, and legally barred him from entering her historic property without law enforcement present. Tom felt the ground shifting beneath his feet and immediately went into a state of rabid, defensive panic. He began calling every relative in our family tree, screaming that I had violently brainwashed and manipulated a dying woman to steal their collective inheritance. Distant cousins I hadn't spoken to in over a decade flooded my phone with vicious, toxic accusations. One claimed Tom had shown him fabricated receipts proving Judy paid my monthly rent. Another said Judy had spent years weeping to the family about my pathetic inability to hold down a stable job. I sat on the sofa in Judy's living room, calmly reading the hateful messages aloud to her. Judy listened silently, her face hardening into a mask of pure, absolute resolution. She reached over, took my phone directly out of my hand, and systematically blocked every single one of their numbers herself. I spent far too many years keeping a fragile peace for people who never once stepped up to protect either of us. Natalie, she said, her voice completely steady, stripped of all former fear. I don't want peace anymore if peace means helping my own son continue to lie. To bring this nightmare to a definitive end, Judy proposed a final, high-stakes strategy herself. She had Patricia arrange a family meeting right inside her house under the false pretense that she was considering withdrawing all official legal allegations if Tom would personally explain the corporate documents and return control of her private trust. Tom, driven by his immense arrogance and his desperate need to regain total control, walked right into the trap. He arrived carrying a sleek leather portfolio, followed by a corrupt private doctor and a biased notary he had hired to validate Judy's supposed mental decline. Patricia sat firmly beside my grandmother at the kitchen table, while I stood silently near the dark doorway, keeping my eyes locked on him. Plainclothes detectives and Susan Mercer were stationed quietly in the adjoining dining room, monitoring every single sound through a hidden, legally authorized transmitter. Tom smoothly laid out a new power of attorney, a revised trust, and a pre-written statement painting me as a hostile extortionist. He sighed, looking at Judy with fake paternal sympathy. Natalie has already lost her job, Mom. She is desperate, she needs your money, and she's using this investigation to get it. I leaned against the doorframe, my voice calm and ice-cold. I am only on temporary administrative leave, Tom, I corrected him. Not for long, he shot back, a cruel, triumphant sneer flashing across his face. Judy opened her handwritten ledger, looking down at the numbers she had meticulously tracked. $187,000. Withdrawn from my accounts. $312,000 borrowed against my house. $68,000 transferred to your firm, she read aloud, her voice ringing through the quiet room. Is that close, Tom? Tom's pristine composure finally slipped. His face twisted into an ugly mask of pure rage as he realized he was losing his grip on the narrative. He leaned across the table, his eyes burning with malice, completely forgetting the doctor and notary standing behind him. You will sign these papers right now, old woman, or I will personally have you declared legally incompetent by the state, he snarled, his teeth bared. Natalie will be prosecuted for fraud, Lisa will lose absolutely everything, and you will spend the rest of your miserable days dying inside a locked memory care facility where total strangers control your life. Judy didn't flinch. She slowly reached beneath her incorrectly buttoned cardigan and pulled out a small, sleek digital audio recorder. Mort wanted you to explain your Tung Quan threats clearly on the record, Tom, she said softly. Tom froze, the blood draining completely from his face. Before he could lunge across the table to smash the device, I stepped directly between them, my posture rigid and unyielding. Judy grabbed the fraudulent power of attorney documents and tore them cleanly in half. You spent years telling this family I was too confused to say no, she said, throwing the torn paper directly into his face. Watch me say it now. Get out of my house. The heavy oak front door swung open and the detectives stepped into the kitchen, their badges catching the light as they informed Tom he was under arrest for elder exploitation, witness intimidation, corporate forgery, and grand larceny. As the steel handcuffs clicked tightly around his wrists, Tom looked back at Judy, his eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic disbelief. You're choosing her? You're destroying this family and choosing a failure over your own son? Judy stood tall, looking down at him with a profound, aching pity. I am choosing the truth over the son I kept inventing excuses for, she said quietly. The legal fallout was catastrophic for Tom Brooks. The full forensic investigation uncovered 4 separate shell companies, deeply hidden contracts, and more than $740,000 systematically stolen or borrowed against my grandmother's life savings. Investigators also found millions of dollars diverted from other elderly clients who had trusted his prestigious financial firm. A grand jury indicted him on dozens of felony charges. His professional license was permanently revoked. His firm was placed into receivership, his luxury assets were seized for restitution, and he was sentenced to a substantial term in federal prison. My internal investigation at the agency lasted nearly 4 months. Forensic IT specialists fully confirmed that the access logs had been completely fabricated by Tom's hackers, and my name was entirely cleared and reinstated. However, the physical and emotional price of the battle was deeply real. The promotion went to someone else during my suspension. Several superficial family relationships were permanently shattered, and for months, I woke up in the dead of night, convinced I heard his footsteps lingering outside my window. Exposing the truth hadn't prevented the immense damage. It had simply made the damage worth surviving. Today, Judy's home is restored entirely to her name, her savings have been largely recovered, and she is the primary guest speaker. For a regional program we established to help other families recognize the silent, suffocating signs of coercive financial control. If you are listening to this final chapter, and your own family constantly insists that you are the failure, the outcast, or the disappointing child, I want you to ask yourself one ultimate, life-altering question. Are they truly disappointed because you failed? Or are they terrified because your incredible success threatens the exact version of you they desperately need to control? My name is Natalie Brooks. For 15 long years, my father told the entire world that I had accomplished nothing. But when the smoke cleared and the cell door locked, the only life built entirely on failure was his. Thank you so much for your time and attention. This video is completely fictional and created strictly for storytelling, psychological insight, and educational entertainment. We hope this story reminds you that sometimes the greatest, most profound form of justice is not watching your abusers suffer, but seeing yourself finally happy, beautifully, free, and no longer controlled by the heavy pain they caused.